Thank you very much, ma'am, for that kind introduction. Sirs, ma'am, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. One of my biggest reservations about being asked to talk today, much like my colleagues here, was the feeling that I was unable to value add anything significant given my lack of experience. Obviously, I know nothing of warfighting beyond what I've read or heard, nor am I an SME in millennial psychology. So being the good art student that I am, I want to talk about this topic in broad contemplative strokes, drawing largely on my own experience and some resources from DFR. In my short RAF career, I've encountered a wide variety of people, all who have their own story of service. With no single characteristic or motivation continuous among these people, I have noticed roughly 3 distinct groups of people in terms of age when it comes to the question of why they joined. The first are those senior personnel aged 45 to 60 who joined roughly between 1977 and 1992 in a post-Vietnam peacetime force. The second are those in the 25 to 45 age group, having likely served in Timor, Afghanistan and Iraq. And the third group is that myself and my cohort belong to, having joined post-2013 till the present day, serving through a somewhat wind down of operations in the Middle East, the upswing in DAC A and DAC C, as well as the fight against ISIS. Painting in broad strokes, it is this first group who I believe most strongly characterise the quote-unquote traditional image of military service. This group appear to have joined for intrinsic reasons of service, duty and sacrifice. The second group, having largely dealt with Timor and the Middle East at the tactical level, I believe too are instilled with this intrinsic sense of motivation. The third group, my group, however, are relatively inexperienced in service and have largely joined during a period where the ADF and wider society are undergoing widespread reforms, especially to do with the recruiting mechanisms which the ADF uses. I believe that as a result of these changes, millennials have joined the ADF primarily for extrinsic reasons such as pay, career advancements and benefits, with intrinsic factors of service coming in secondary. These changes don't necessarily indicate the inundation of defence by self-seeking narcissists. However, I see it more as a subtle reordering of priorities. Noting that I have just called some members of the audience senior and others selfish, I first need to develop and justify why I think that millennials have this changed sense of motivation. First, a brief appreciation of the science. Adolescents, which the World Health Organization defines as those aged between 15 and 24, have brains which function fundamentally different to those of adults. Broadly, as Colonel Kilpatrick and other academics have stated, adolescent brains struggle to control the impact of emotion. They struggle to have levels of self-control similar to that of adults, and they drastically prefer short-term rewards as compared to the long-term. The outcome of these differences is represented nicely in this diagram, which focuses on intrinsic versus extrinsic, with largely adolescents on the right and adults on the left. Assuming that the brain function, however, is the same as it was 50 years ago, what basis do I have for suggesting that there's now a significant difference in the way in why millennials are motivated to join? Well, broadly, I see multiple factors contributing to this. One being the rise of technology, changing economic factors, societal expectations, and the development of a quote-unquote on-demand mindset, setting millennials apart from the previous generations. With technology has come a materialistic desire to display one's success online. The rising cost of living focuses attention on seeking higher wages, and the trend of wanting things on demand makes millennials less motivated to work for that which may take an increased amount of time. From the research, there appears a consensus that the current generation are more inclined towards narcissistic behaviour than ever before. This change, I believe, is consistent with the societal and scientific factors I explained earlier. With adolescents being motivated by short-term, often emotional factors, it is not unsurprising that in a society that values personal status, that has heightened demands on our younger people, we see the younger generation trending towards self-interested and short-term gains. The question obviously then comes, what does this trend look like in the ADF? Well, numerically, the ADF is dominated by adolescents and young adults, with the average recruiting age being 80% of those aged between 15 and 24 in that adolescent bracket that I described earlier. And this age dynamic to a large extent reflects the need or the want of ADF to recruit members from the beginning of their career to then skill them up rather than having to compete with the skilled labour force later on. Now, despite the personal experiences of probably many in the room, DFR is not stupid, nor do they not know what they're doing. Rather, they reinforce a lot of the claims I've made today, and debatably for good reason. ADF advertising, as it currently stands, makes no qualms with using extrinsic motivating factors such as career progression, competitive pay, reassurances of family, friends, children, as well as the participation in extracurricular activities. Indeed, the head of ADF recruiting, Colonel Hoagland, recently spoke to ADFA and was very open about how the ADF wishes to tap into potential recruits' selfishness during this initial exposure to the ADF. As you can see from the screen clippings on the screen, the ADF messaging at the moment is currently very much appealing to self-interest. Indeed, rather than prompting recruits to think about what they can do for Australia, we appear to be demanding that they ask what Australia can do for them. A nice comparison is this quote from a 1981 RAND recruitment video that openly talks about hardship and service in pursuit of a goal higher than yourself as a means of attracting young people. And I would probably propose that this is a tactic not necessarily that would work in the current day. Furthermore, this image, which was an actual ad campaign run by the British Army in 2018, highlights that the trend towards appealing to an individual's self-interest is not isolated to Australia, but rather it truly is a global trend. To conclude, I want to posit some personal thoughts on how this current dynamic may impact future warfighting operations for the RAF. Firstly, the expectation of ADF recruits are likely misaligned with the organisation's overall objectives. The current recruitment message being broadcast is not one that seeks out service as would be required in a time of war. Those joining would likely need to rapidly re-evaluate their expectations if sent on combat operations. If someone is joining ADFA for the degree, pay and job security, can they truly be the best person to contribute and lead life-threatening operations? Sending a young technician or logistics officer to a forward operating base in the Middle East therefore could pose a serious risk if that individual is not prepared to rapidly realign their mindset. From the little that I understand of deployments, an individual who is unprepared to be selfless and push themselves to get the job done will likely not have many friends on their return. In addition to concerns of group cohesion, the extreme risk is that younger people will become completely operationally ineffective, deciding outright that they are unwilling to serve and be part of what the core business of the ADF is, warfighting. An extension of this issue is the current dichotomy, it seems to be, of ADF operations between humanitarian and combat. These images are taken from recent ADF advertisements which focus quite heavily on the humanitarian side of the house. While I certainly don't disregard the importance or necessity of humanitarian operations, it would be incorrect to use these type of operations as a carrot to attract the future members of the ADF who might falsely believe that this is in fact the primary, not secondary role of our organisation. The RAF certainly will continue and likely increase its DAC A and DAC C capability. However, I believe there's a significant risk to having a junior workforce that believes these operation types as the status quo. And this brings me to my final and what I believe is the most important point. What now happens should the RAF engage in a high-intensity conflict? I mean no disrespect to those who have served in the Middle East and Timor, but we need to look back to World War II and Korea, to a time where the RAF operated without air supremacy or air superiority. And while a high-intensity conflict is not a certainty, the RAF, I believe, cannot afford to operate in the assumption that it will not occur. If large amounts of our junior ranks who would be serving at the tactical level are motivated by money and career progression, how easily will it be to convince them to dogfight with an enemy of parity, defend an airbase at risk of assault, or strategically bomb civilians? There are not enough Instagram likes, career benefits, or early knockoffs that will be enough extrinsic motivation in war. What good are they if it comes with the risk of death or moral corruption? If war was to break out tomorrow, our junior personnel would rapidly need to acquire a sense of intrinsic motivation if they are to be effective operators, a task easier said than done. Finally, I want to leave you with two thoughts that I hope inspire some discussion and thought. Firstly, is this intrinsic mindset that I've spoke about today even something that can be created? Or as an organisation, do we just need to accept this extrinsic-based focus and move on? And secondly, is it valid, as I've just done, to use the threat of a high-intensity conflict as a guide to guide our decision-making and our recruitment process? Thank you very much for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Officer Cadet Ryan, and it's been a pleasure to speak to you today.